Well, as I said, we're going through this series in Exodus, and there really is, I guess, what you could call the lost language of redemption. There's a way in which we've become familiar about talking about our salvation as Christians that is in some way disconnected with what the story of the Exodus is showing. And I've said this before, if the wonderful thing about the Old Testament is that it doesn't just give you principles, it gives you stories. It gives you a way of understanding what it means to be redeemed, what it means to be in relationship with God that is epic in scale and scope. And there is no more epic part of the book of Exodus, arguably, than God appearing to Moses and revealing his name to him. If we really want to understand what it means to be a Christian, if we want to understand what it means to grasp what has happened to us and what God is calling us to in the world and with him individually, then we have to understand this story. And actually, the chapter this week has come down to the fundamental principle, the fundamental part of the story of meeting with God himself. What does it look like to really, truly meet with God? And who is the God with whom we are meeting? Every major world religion has something to say, or some idea of some theology or some theory of what it's like to meet with God. There was actually a study that was done in the early 20th century that resulted in a book called The Idea of the Holy. And there was a German philosopher and theologian who went round and asked many people from different major religions about what it was like to experience God from their tradition and from their religious standpoint. And there were three qualities that he drew out that came away from all of those interviews that he did. And they were these three things. Awfulness. Right? It doesn't mean bad, but awe. Fullness of wonder and fullness of awe. That's the first thing. The second thing was overpoweringness. And the third thing was energy. A sense of being impelled and sent to do something. Awfulness, overpoweringness, and energy. And a few centuries before this, there was a French philosopher named Blaise Pascal, and he had an experience of God that he recorded in his diary. You can actually go and read this if you find it online. It says this: the year of grace, 1654. Monday, 23rd of November, feast of St. Clement. He was a Catholic. From about 10:30 at night until about midnight, midnight. Fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and of the learned. Certitude, feeling, joy, peace. God of Jesus Christ. My God and your God. That was his experience of God. What would it look like for you to really meet God, either this morning or at some other point? How would you know if you'd met him? Who really is the God that we're encountering? Do we really know what he's like? The wonderful thing is, there is a place where he defines it for us, and it's here in Exodus chapter 3. If you've been walking through life and thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a place where God really laid out for us what it was like to meet with him? Well, here it is. Plain as day, Exodus chapter 3. Here we have it from God himself. And we're going to learn 4 short things from this incredible passage here this morning. We're going to learn that God is the God of detours and delays. That he's the God of fire and fear. That he is the God of absolute and total sufficiency. And he is the God of mysterious nearness. So firstly, he's the God of detours and delays. Do you know how old Moses is at this point in Exodus chapter 3? Some of you will. He's 80. He's 80 years old. See, the days where he lived in Egypt are far behind him. His past in Egypt, in the palaces of Pharaoh, must have been a distant memory to him. You'll know if you were here last week that Moses fled the country as a fugitive and a failure when he was 40. But now it's 40 years later than that. See, Moses' life is on a 40-year detour. At this point of his life, it's at a complete dead end. Right, when we find him in this story at the beginning of chapter 3, he is shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. What that means is Moses probably didn't have any assets or wealth of his own. It wasn't his own flock. It was the flock of his father-in-law. Moses had been stripped of everything that he thought made him who he was. He was no longer a prince of Egypt. He was no longer living in the lap of luxury with all the treasure and money he could possibly have wanted or needed. He was no longer amongst his people in Israel. As we saw last week, he was a stranger in a foreign land. He'd gone from the lap of luxury in Egypt to scratching out a meager existence in the wilderness and in the desert. And Moses has gone from being what every Egyptian aspired to be to what every Egyptian despised, because they despised shepherds. They were an abomination to the Egyptians. See, not only that, but when verse 1 uses the verb keeping, he was keeping the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro. That actually implies a repeated and ongoing habitual action. It's like Moses was just doing the same thing again and again and again and again, 40 years. He was basically just working a 9-to-5 job. Now, those of you that know shepherding will know that shepherding is not a 9-to-5 job. It's far more than that. But he was doing it over and over again and just going through the motions with no end in sight in the desert, grinding away. Long years of silence in the wilderness, all alone, with no word from friend or family or from the God that he left behind in Egypt. So the end of verse 1 actually presses this even further. See, Moses is on the west side of the wilderness, we're told. And the literal phrase there in Hebrew is the backside. Right? Moses is in the back of beyond. Right? There are A roads and B roads in the UK. He's not even on a C or D road. He's on a Z road. Right? He is absolutely in the middle of nowhere. He's in the 80th year of his life. Right? He's in the back of beyond, geographically and figuratively. A whole new generation would have arisen in Egypt. The people that Moses would have known when he was there would have been dead. And yet, it is here and at this time and in this detour in Moses' life that where he's about to meet with God. And he's about to meet with him in a profound way. Friends, God is not in our kind of hurry. He is not working to our timetables. He is not working to our schedules. He does not share the same unconscious expectations about when and where he should act that we do. The management reserves the right to act when he will. God is not in our kind of hurry. See, even in the long and arduous detours of our lives, when it feels as if we're emptied and we have lost more than we've gained, those are the moments that God chooses to make himself known to us. Right? Well, why is that? It's because it's at those times where we're more closely connected to reality as it truly is. When comforts are removed, when everything feels far away. You know, it's not in palaces, it's not in the beating heart of a major city that God meets with Moses, but it's on a mountain in the desert as he's working his normal job. It's in the lonely wilderness where he is just going through the motions of his daily life. Right? Think about how Moses must have felt at this point. We kind of touched on it last week. Moses must have felt useless. I mean, he must have felt used up. He had given his best shot to being the deliverer of Israel. He'd given his best shot to trying to precipitate the children of Israel being freed from slavery and coming out by a great deliverance, and he failed. He was a failure. He was a fugitive. He lost everything. And all of this is reminding us here this morning that you are never more ready to meet God or be used by him than when you feel totally used up and useless. I would argue that nobody has ever genuinely come to God and become a Christian unless they have gotten to that point. Rock bottom is a difficult place to be. Rock bottom is a detour. See, Moses thought that his life was on a detour, but the truth is he was on Main Street. He was about to meet with the Lord. See, look at who God chooses, not just here in this story, but throughout the whole Bible. Who does God choose? The weakest, the vilest, the poor. Right? The one who was born last, the one who was overlooked, the weak, the women of this world. People who we would not expect, the tax collectors and the sinners, the demonized, the marginalized, the diseased, the leprous, people who have been written off, the used up and the useless. Those are the people whom God chooses. God has no interest in anyone who thinks that they have something to offer. No interest. And Moses is in that place. So I wonder, where do you feel used up? Where does your life feel like it's on an 40-year detour? Can you sympathize with how Moses feels here this morning? You know, is it that family member who's just wandering and seems to have drifted away? Is it the promise of a career or marriage that just hasn't materialized? Do you feel far away from home, literally? Right? Does church feel increasingly different and strange as things change and new people come in? In what way do you feel like a stranger in a foreign land? Those times where you feel used up and useless, those times where you feel like you are in a rut, those times where you feel stuck and have a sense of dislocation from the life you wanted and the God you thought you knew, are the moments where he will meet with you if you turn aside and look. If you turn aside and look and seek him. Because Moses thought that his life was in a ditch, but he was actually on the mountain. Because the God of detours and delays, who governs the circumstances of our lives, had directed his life to meet there with him on the mountain, and he will do the same with you. But he's not just the God of detours and delays. He's not just the God who directs the course of the river of our life into his presence. He is also the God of fire and fear. Listen to verses 2 to 6. If you have it, look down at it. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, and yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Right, so God appears to Moses in a flame of fire out of the bush, and he calls Moses to come, doesn't he? He calls Moses to come close. But then immediately after God says that to Moses, he says, don't come near. He says, come close. Stay away. The place on which you're standing is holy ground. It's too pure for you to walk on it. That's strange, isn't it? That's really strange. It should be strange to us because, in fact, God repeats Moses' name twice when he calls him. You know, every time someone's name is repeated twice in the Old Testament, that's a sign of endearment. It's actually a sign of affection. It's a sign of intimacy and closeness. And yet, at the same time, God says, don't come any closer. He's inviting Moses to kind of intimate communion with him, but he's also barring him from coming any closer to access that intimacy. So which is it? Right? Does God want Moses close, or does he want him far away? Yes, is the answer. As is so often, the paradox of this passage is that the answer is yes. See, we've come up here against what theologians call God's transcendence. It's a way of describing what the Bible calls God's holiness. And God's holiness is often described in the Bible in terms of fire. Not actually in theological language, but in imagery. So this imagery of fire is used to show us that God is utterly other. He's utterly unique. He is set apart in a category of his own, far above all else in the universe. Think of it like the sun. Right? The sun stands at the center of our solar system. Everything revolves around it. The sun is unique. It's powerful. It's the source of all the beautiful and diverse and varied life on our planet. Without the sun, the earth would be this dead rock of ice floating aimlessly through the cosmos. And in that way, you could say that the sun is holy. Right? Even the immediate area around the sun is holy, because if you try to fly closer to it, the more intense the radiation, the heat, and the light will get. The very power and the goodness that generates life is also dangerous. It's even fatal to anyone that approaches it. If you approach the sun unprotected, you will disintegrate, you will come apart. And that is the paradox that is at the heart of God's own fiery holiness. If you are impure or sinful in any way, even a little bit, to come close to God's holiness is fatal to you, not because it's bad, but because it's so good. And the first time we see that paradox is actually here in the story of Moses in Exodus chapter 3. And we have to pay close attention here. We have to. Because it's in this that we find the whole problem with humanity. Right? We cannot live with God, but we cannot live without him. That is your problem and my problem here this morning. There's the problem of every single person in this city, every single person in this nation, and every single person in this world. You cannot live with God, but you cannot live without him. Right? Think about what fire is like. Fire is necessary to sustain life. Without fire, we would die. Actually, even today, we've had a run of really good weather recently, but it gets pretty cold here in winter. We depend on either a wood-burning stove or the fire in our boilers to heat the house and to stop us from freezing to death, or at the very least becoming very sick. But if that fire were to break out, it would quickly destroy our home and everyone inside it. And you might have heard about the wildfire recently on Arthur's Seat that blazed across it. In our own city, there have been many fires that have destroyed buildings and lives of people. Fire is necessary for life, but it is so dangerous. Fire warms, but it consumes. It gives life, but it also destroys. Fire is not entirely containable or predictable, and this passage is telling us that's what God's like. That's what God is like. He is compelling. He is mysterious. He's difficult to grasp. He's dangerous and wild, yet affectionate and warm and even intimate with us. And the right response to that, we're told, is fear. What does it say? Moses was afraid to look at God. The end of verse 6. That's all of us, by the way. We're all afraid to look at him. We're all afraid, so to speak, to look God in the eye. To really take him for who he is. Like a child avoiding eye contact with a parent that when they know they've done something wrong, Moses feared what he would see when he looked into the eyes of the one who knows all things. He knows Moses' life from top to bottom and our lives from top to bottom, and we are really afraid to look at God. So what we do is we either hide our face from him entirely by having nothing to do with God or Christianity or the church. We avoid anything to do with that, like the plague. That's one of the ways we avoid him. Or what we do is we edit him. We edit out the things about the Bible, the things about God that we find problematic, so we can kind of sidle up to God and find him less challenging and less problematic and more manageable. But try as we might, the consuming fire is still there, crackling in the distance, beckoning us, daring us to come closer, daring us to take off the shoes from our feet, because the place on which we are standing is holy ground. Listen, you may have been at church your entire life and never actually looked God in the eye. I wonder if that's you here this morning. Do you know how you can test this for yourself? Have you ever had an experience of God like Moses had? Have you ever experienced anything like this? I'm not talking about a literal burning bush. I'm talking about a sense of fear, a sense of awe, a sense that there is somebody else in the room dealing with you. Look, we could get philosophical and keep talking about transcendence, but let's keep it simple. Fire is experienced. You smell the smoke. You feel the heat. You see the flames flicker and you hear the crack of the fire itself. Listen, before this point, Moses probably had a lot of ideas about God, but here he experiences God. Has your knowledge of God become experience of God? Have you felt the heat? Because unless we have been on our knees, more or less in tears because of the awful holiness of God, we haven't begun. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, because he's the God of fire and fear, beckoning you to come close. Dare you? Dare you tread those steps and stand on holy ground? But he's also the God of absolute sufficiency. Now, there are two things that we need to grasp in this passage when we think about the sufficiency of God. It's the fire itself, which we've already talked about, and the name that God reveals in verse 14. See, when Moses comes across the bush in verses 2 to 3, the reason he turns aside is the reason any of us would turn aside, because the bush is burning with fire, and yet it's not burned up. It's not consumed. It's not actually fuel for the fire. See, that's odd, isn't it? And Moses was a nomadic person at that point. Nomadic people moving through the desert know how to make a fire. They're very experienced at it. I couldn't build a fire to save my life, but Moses would have known what he was doing. Fire needs fuel to burn and sustain itself. And once the fuel is gone, the fire burns out, right? The fire dies. But this fire is self-sustaining. The fire fuels itself without consuming what it touches. Ordinarily, fire depends on something else for energy and life. But this fire has its own source of being and power within it. What that means is that God depends on nothing outside of himself for life and energy. He doesn't draw life from anything else. He is independent. He is free. In fact, God is the furnace of life itself. And that's driven home further in verse 14 when God reveals his name to Moses. He says, I am who I am. Right? In Hebrew, that is literally just the verb to be with a relative pronoun in the middle of it. It literally says, I be who I be. Right? You could easily translate that as a present tense verb, I am who I am, or as a future tense verb. You might have a footnote that says that. I will be whom I will be. And listen, I'm trying to, as much as I can, avoid being too theological and technical here, but there is so much that we could say about just those few words here. Listen, when somebody asks us who we are, we usually reply, yes, with our name, or where we're from, or our job, or something like that. But here, in verse 14, is yet another statement from God that seems to be missing the last part. Right? If you met me and asked, who are you? And I just said, I am, you'd think I was cracked in the head. Right? You want to go to a different church because the pastor of this one seems like a nutcase. But what Christians have understood by the name I am is that God is absolute being. He is ultimate reality. He's the ground of everything. In more theological language, it means that God has existence as a part of his essence. It's what makes him who he is. Now go with me on this. Like every other part of creation, including us, we receive existence as a gift. None of us have existed forever, as far as I'm aware. But there was a point in which we didn't exist, and there was a point at which we came into existence. We depended upon something outside of ourselves to give us our existence, and we depend upon a million other things to sustain that existence as we go on in life. But it's not the same with God. He's always existed. Existence is a part of his absolute nature. He has always been, and he always will be. And here is a very simple application of that very theological idea. Without God, we can do nothing. Without God, we can do nothing. Hasn't Moses already experienced that? 40 years before, he tried to take matters into his own hands, and it was a disaster. It was a disaster. But Moses is about to get the mother of all second chances because God is sufficient. We'll see next week that the experience of the last 40 years, and we'll see this in chapter 4, has utterly humbled Moses and brought him low. So much so that he has no confidence in himself anymore. And boy, can I sympathize with that. See, God has shown Moses that he can do nothing, but God is about to show him that all things are possible for the one who believes. Moses may be insufficient, but God is all sufficient. He is enough. Right, there's a story in the New Testament that we preached through when we went through the Gospel of Mark. There was a poor synagogue leader named Jairus whose daughter was sick. And he comes to Jesus because he knows that he can't do anything. He's a leader in his community. He's got money, he's got means, but there is a sickness that he can't cure. So he comes and he falls to Jesus' feet. And one of the things that he says to Jesus is, I believe, help my unbelief. What that is essentially saying is, I can't change this, but you can. I'm insufficient, but you are sufficient. You are enough. Right? Think about what Moses is being asked to do here. Just think for a second. He's an 80-year-old man. He's being asked to go back to a place that he hasn't seen in decades, to a people who don't remember him, with a message from God, from a God they've totally forgotten. Wouldn't Moses have had every right to say, look, I'm not sufficient for this. I'm going to leave this to the young people. Right? He's an old man. Things back in Egypt has changed. He doesn't know the culture. He hasn't been around for 40 years. He's been left behind by events. Things have moved on. The world of Egypt would have been confusing to him. Like, I don't think it would surprise any of us if Moses just chose to live out the tail end of his life in the quiet of the desert and to just die in obscurity, and yet God is not going to allow him to do that. God calls Moses to lead and then sends him back into the fray. Look, I know that this church has seen a lot of change over the years. Change is bewildering, and it's not always easy to see the way forward or to communicate how we should go forward. I know as leaders, we probably could do a better job at that. But look at what is happening to Moses here. Moses is being called to re-engage with God's mission here, and the same applies to us. Our society tends to discard older people as irrelevant. As a nation, we tend to privilege and prioritize the young, but I can tell you, as one who spends many hours a week with the older members of this church, God is not done with you yet. You may feel like you are insufficient, but the God whom you serve is sufficient. Will you remain in the wilderness? Or will you answer the call? Will you turn aside? Will you come with us for the sake of the gospel? Because God is sufficient. But there's a final thing I want to share with you, because there is a mystery at the heart of this passage, as there is in the heart of every passage. I feel like I say this every week. There is a mystery at the heart of this passage, and it is the mysterious nearness of God. The mysterious nearness of God. See, in the midst of this, Moses is led to ask, who am I? Who am I that I should lead the people of God out of the land of Egypt? And what's interesting is that God doesn't answer Moses like you and I would. Right? We live in a culture of self-esteem, and God doesn't say, come on now, Moses, you were raised in Pharaoh's palace. You've got the education, you've got the training, you've got the experience, you've even been humbled by the wilderness. You can do it. You're the man for the job. What God actually says in response to Moses, who am I, is, I will be with you. Did you see that? Moses says, who am I? And God says to him, here's who I am. I will be with you. I am the one who will always be there. Now, the who am I question is one that every one of us is used to asking, especially today. We have an identity-obsessed culture. Our identities have become fluid and therefore very unstable and very fragile and very easily threatened. They're brittle. They are thin. We are easily hurt, myself included, and we can constantly reinvent ourselves. We can get a new job, we can move to a new city, we can go to a new church, we can join another online community, we can even choose to redefine something as fundamental to us as our very gender. See, identity for us has become something that we achieve rather than receive. That is a fundamental shift that has happened in our day and age. And because of that shift, our identity is always, always under threat in some way. We're always trying to guard it and shore it up from leaking through our hands. So how do we find a sense of self based not on either our circumstances externally or our shifting inner sense of who we are or our achievements? And you find it here in the mysterious nearness of God, because instead of looking inward to answer that question, Moses actually looks outward and upward. He asks God. It's interesting. Moses starts to go, well, who am I? And turn inwards. And God grabs him and forces him to look upwards and say, no, who am I? I am the one who will always be with you. See, Moses is going to face incredible pressures and dangers as he returns to Egypt to deliver Israel. Even as he goes out of Israel into the wilderness to take Israel to the mountain that he is on right now, he's going to face grumbling, he's going to face sabotage, he's going to face the idolatry and sin of his people, he's going to face the limitations of his own anger and temper, his own failings, which will cause him to even fail to reach the promised land itself. Moses is going to face a lot, and he is going to need an identity that can weather that. He's going to need an identity that can weather all the trials and sufferings he's going to encounter. He needs the presence of the I am, like all of us. He needs to base his sense of self on his knowledge of God and the nearness of God. He needs to know that God is there with him, is for him, and will be there for him in the future. That's why it's the I am. And I will be, and I will go with you, and here's what's going to happen. I'm going to lay it out for you in the future. But the mystery here is, how can God be with Moses? How can God be with Moses? We've already talked about it, haven't we? God is holy. He can't be near an impure and sinful people. But the clue is in the burning bush itself. Right? The miracle that we tend to focus on in this passage is that the burning bush is not consumed. Ironically, we call it the burning bush, but the fact is the bush isn't burning. But I would say that's not the right question. The question you really need to ask is, why is Moses not consumed? Why is Moses not consumed? And the answer is one of the most profound mysteries of this passage. Look at verse 4. Look at verse 4. Who is calling Moses from within the bush? It's God. But look at verse 2. Who is appearing to Moses? It's the angel of the Lord. Right, to put it simply, the angel of the Lord is the mediator of the presence of God himself. As we go through the book of Exodus, you will see the angel of the Lord cropping up over and over again. Actually, the angel of the Lord is the one whom God sends to lead his people through the pillar of fire and pillar of cloud through the Red Sea and into the desert, to lead them day and night until they come to Mount Sinai to meet with him. But in the same way, it's not just the angel of the Lord that goes with them, it is the Lord himself. See, this angel is distinct from God, and yet in some mysterious way, he is God. This angel is the way that God can draw near to Moses and to Israel later on without consuming them, without annihilating them, without wiping them out. And one of the commentaries I read this week said this: the angel suffers no reduction or adjustment of his full deity, yet he is that mode of deity whereby the holy God can keep company with sinners. There is only one other in the Bible who is both identical with and yet distinct from the Lord. One who, without abandoning the full essence and prerogatives of deity or diminishing the divine holiness, is able to accommodate himself to the company of sinners. And who, while affirming the wrath of God, is yet a supreme display of his outreaching mercy. The angel of the Lord cannot be understood except as a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. You want to know how Moses cannot be consumed? You want to know how God can draw near to Moses and sinful people like you and I? It's through Jesus. It's through the mediator of the covenant. It's through the angel of the Lord. See, if you actually flipped to John's gospel and read it, you'll know that there are many places where Jesus himself uses the telltale phrase, I am. And he's doing that deliberately. Right, there's a moment at the end of John's gospel when Jesus is about to be arrested by a group of soldiers. And they come and they basically demand of him, are you Jesus of Nazareth? And Jesus simply says, I am. And do you know what happens to those soldiers? Flattened. They all fall on their faces. Why? Well, because they've basically come up against what Moses came up against. They didn't realize it, but they were standing on holy ground. And because of the glory and the power and the holiness and the fear of God, they couldn't keep their feet. Friends, every single one of us is going to stand before God at one point or another. And the question you need to ask yourself is, how am I going to keep my feet? How am I going to stop myself from falling on my face before a holy God who knows everything I've ever done, every bitter thought, every evil deed, every word that has come out of my mouth? How can I draw near to him? Because he's the only way that I can receive mercy and forgiveness and yet not be consumed. Well, it's Jesus. Jesus is the great I am. Jesus is the consuming fire. He is the glory of God veiled in human flesh and mediated to us in a way that we can handle. And he is ultimately the way that you and I can encounter a holy God, knowing that we can be forgiven. You want to experience God? You want to know what it's like to really meet with him? I think it's the Apostle Paul that puts it elsewhere in the Bible. We have seen the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Jesus himself is the way to God. He is the truth of God, and he is the life of God itself. Self-sustaining, self-sufficient, all-sufficient. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Listen, I don't know how to land the plane here this morning, because we could keep circling and talking about the I am. We could keep circling and talking about the call that Moses has received. But all I want you to grasp this morning is that God is so much greater than we give him credit for. God is so much more wonderful and profound and mysterious than a lifetime could ever uncover. God is so much more gracious and kind to sinful people like you and me. We don't deserve it. Do you know him? Do you want to know him? Will you turn aside? Let's pray. Father, please forgive us. Because we just don't know what you're like. Father, we just long in this church to have you with us. Lord, please hear our prayer.
And I just pray for anyone here this morning who doesn't know you, or who feels far from you, feels like they're wandering in the desert, feels like they're on a detour. Lord, may they hear you calling them their name, and may they answer. Lord, we just confess our belief in you this morning. Thank you so much that you accommodate to weak sinners like us. Thank you that this morning we stand on holy ground. Amen.